Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today I have the first part of my October wrap-up. The 3 books mentioned here are the 3 books that I had left of my coordinated TBR to read in September and rolled them over to the first week of October. There is only one booktuber that I need to mention here, the other 2 had coordinates that came from my family. If you're wondering, then the coordinated TBR was something I created by asking for coordinates on Twitter. Those coordinates corresponded to books on my shelves, and then I created a TBR with those numbers. The first book in this wrap-up is Embers of War by Gareth Powell. I had high hopes for this book going into it. Earlier this year, I watched Guardians of the Galaxy, and it awoke some childhood nostalgia in me for those sorts of films that are all about space. And the internet called it a space opera. Me, being Charlie and not very au fait with genres, didn't know what to expect. This book said space opera on it, and thus I purchased it. I had high hopes because it is this story of a sentient ship and it has a female captain and there's a lot of female characters on this ship in this book. And you know, that's something that Charlie likes to see represented in fiction when it's represented well. Before this book begins, a captain on a ship decides to basically destroy a planet that destroys a sentient forest or something like that. And then you go a few years into the future and Captain Sel Constance is part of this like church deal thing. They go out and they rescue ships in distress. And she is called to this ship. This poet happens to be on. And people are searching for this poet. And this woman doesn't know why. She's just going there to save this thing. And then it unveils this ultimate conspiracy. As, you know, series do. This is told from multiple perspectives. Yet if it didn't tell you who was speaking at the start of each chapter, you would have no idea who was speaking because there is little variation between the tones of these characters. Mostly it's just a difference of circumstances or stories. I found that a lot of tropes were used in here, and tropes are fine. You know, we've seen it talked about enough on BookTube now. Whilst I personally am not a fan of seeing the same thing over and over again in fiction, I understand that this book isn't necessarily for me. I didn't enjoy it. It felt really weird to me because there was this really slow, casual build-up to something. I meant gradual then, but you get what I'm saying. And then at the final 150 pages were just action, 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 revelation, revelation, action, revelation. And maybe that's the way of series fiction at the moment. Maybe that's the way these things are supposed to work, but it's not the sort of fiction I enjoy. However, I do think that maybe if you're making your way over from the young adult, as a young adult reader, into more adult science fiction, this might be a good book for you. However, I won't be continuing on with the series. I don't think the characters are well crafted. I think that the storyline is very similar to storylines we've seen all over the place before. I don't think that every book has to bring something new to fiction, but I do need something within the writing to really spur me on to continue reading. And this writing within this book was just... it was action-packed, it was riveting, it was a fast read, but there didn't seem to be any essence of the writer in there. It didn't seem as though I was seeing an individual writer's voice here. It felt almost stylistic of a genre type, as though someone was trying to move the story along in a certain fashion. The whole reason we have a slow gradual build-up is because we're going to all these different characters, and each chapter starts with a new character in the beginning, but the story doesn't really move along for 250 pages and then it moves too quickly. And I'm wondering, if you read the entire series, would the series have been better condensed as one book? and the author being given time to find some individual voice. I don't know. People, he got a lot of fans. This book's doing well. The writer does not need me to be another fanboy. I didn't enjoy it, and I won't be continuing the series. But I imagine that a lot of people will. This next book is The Wicked Cometh by Laura Carlin, and this young woman called Hester ends up nearly getting crushed under a carriage. She's a bit impoverished, and she ends up being saved by this man and introduced to his sister, who is going to educate her. That's the beginning of this book. And yeah, basically you know that there are people going missing. Are they dead? What's going on with them? What is happening with these people? It creates this conspiracy that this Rebecca and Hester are going to solve. And oh my lord, this was the second book in 1 week that disappointed me. I'm going to start with the biggest thing. And this might be a spoiler. I don't know whether I'm going to say the spoiler, but basically something happens early on, well, about the midway point of this book, and it sees two characters falling out with one another. And there are some revelations in the interim before the characters come back together. However, the book is written as though those revelations took place on one night, yet there are so many changes when these two characters are reunited that it felt like much more than one night had moved on, and it really, as a reader, pulled me out of the story because I kept thinking, well, actually, how much time has elapsed here? That was the first major thing that made me stop and look at this book and begin to dislike it, because until this point I had actually enjoyed the style of the writing. I thought that it was very reminiscent of Victorian literature, and I thought it did well of describing the murk of London at the time. However, I do think that this became an overused metaphor for the dinginess and for all the darkness that was taking place within London at the time. Yes, we are going to see the darker characters that we have seen represented in Victorian literature before, and definitely in the Victorian era. We know this sort of thing did happen, what the final revelation turns out being. I felt like this book wanted to be too many things. I felt like it wanted to be a romance, a detective story, and some sort of sensationalist piece of Victorian literature, but ultimately ended up failing at doing any of that because the writer didn't take enough time. I think that if you wanted a romantic story, you needed to remove the darker aspect of it. If you wanted a dark story, you needed to remove the romance aspect. I'm not saying this for all literature. I'm saying it here because it ends up that there is too much going on between the characters for anything to be resolved properly. Indeed, the ending, there is a climax, and then there are another 30 pages as like, and this is what happened afterwards, an epilogue, if you will, which were mightily unnecessary, and the story could have been sorted out right at the climax, but instead we got this silly little bit of an add-on, which I just felt like was the writer caring too much for her characters. Maybe she did plan this out and this is what she came up with. Maybe there was more to this novel originally, and when it was eventually pared down to get the essence of a book, it ended up pared down too far. I think that if the romance was necessary to tell this story, there needed to be another 100 pages. The same with the darkness, because in the end, these characters don't really solve anything. They just stumble across something and it's like, oh, beggar, this shouldn't have happened. What are we going to do now? And I ended up not feeling extremely tense by the end of it in these tense moments. There was one moment that sickened me, however I thought that the grotesque within that scene was simply used because everything else had been so bland up until this point that she needed something to shock us in order to make us continue. So yeah, didn't particularly end up caring for this book in the end, which was a shame. I read The Music Shop by Rachel Joyce. I read this book in one day. If people interrupted me whilst I was reading this book, they got it shouted at. Because I quite like this book. So, there's this guy called Frank and he has a music shop. And then this woman turns up at the door and she faints. And Frank begins to question just who this woman is. And just as with all of Rachel Joyce's other works that I have read, she tells a light-hearted, cosy story that ends up having darkness underneath. There is a darker undertone to all of Rachel Joyce's stories that is never sensationalised, and this darkness is used and employed by the writer to show how characters reach the situations they're in and gives you a better idea and more context to their story so you can make sense of that character. However, it isn't given to you overtly, it comes slowly, you can pick it up yourself. It's kind of an unravelling of a character in order to help them rebuild themselves. And I've noticed this in a few of Joyce's works now. I am a huge fan of the way Rachel Joyce writes. I feel like it could be spoken. I think that if you heard it read, it would be brilliant. I think that she just gets people, and I think that she understands stories and literature enough in order to create brilliant books. This is immediately one of my favourite books that I've read this year. I was a bit saddened by the final part of this book in a similar fashion to the finale of the original Will and Grace, when we skip ahead so many years, but I understand why it was important to telling this story and how it shows that not everything can be fixed in a few months in order to help, make a novel. And I think that it related well to the way we have changed so much over time, that this man who has his vinyl music shop, which is such a big hub of the community in the 1980s, no longer has a place in the world today, but the nostalgia that we feel for that music means that it's bringing a comeback. It's having a comeback, but we aren't thinking about the people that lost livelihoods because of our disinterest 30 years ago. And I think, that's the same for all industry and it's the same for all shops. But I think that what Rachel Joyce has done here is she's captured an idea and a part of humanity that we don't talk about, how easy we find it to throw things away and how easy we find it to forget about things when better things come along. But if you're looking for anything cosy to read for the final few months of the year, then you wouldn't go wrong to read this. And as I said, I read it in a day, and by far the best book that I read that week, and one of the best I've read this year. They are the 3 books that I had to read for the Co-Ordinated TBR. I have 5 left now, and I think I'm just going to read those as we round up this year. The Wicked Cometh came from coordinates that were sent to me by Matthew over at MCS Books, and please do go and check out his channel. He is one of the most creative booktubers that we have out there. His videos and the way he talks about books, in his videos, the way he creates and edits, is like watching BBC4 documentaries. You could see his video clips on Newsnight Review, and he's eloquent, he's smart, he really gets into books and goes into depths in fashions that I don't think that I'd ever be able to. In fact, I'm going to leave a link to one of his videos that I think it highlights the standard of video he's creating, but also goes to show his level of insight and knowledge about literature. Yes, please do go and check out Matthew's channel. And them's the books. If you have read any of these books and would like to discuss them, please feel free to do so down in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video, and until next time, that is all.